She arrived at the training range just after sunrise, the sky a soft orange fading into blue and the cold air still clinging to the dirt under her boots. She was not there to shoot, she was there to fix targets, to tape over bullet holes, to carry wooden frames and heavy rolls of paper from one end of the field to the other. She had done this a dozen times before, quiet, invisible work in the background of louder, sharper lives, the kind of lives that made the ground shake when they walked past her without seeing her, the kind that wore gear that cost more than her monthly paycheck and moved like they owned the place. That morning she kept her head down, not wanting to be in the way, not wanting to attract attention, while the instructors barked orders and the trainees lined up with weapons bigger than her arms. She had a staple gun in her hand, not a rifle, and she was fine with that. Her job was simple: stay out of the line of fire, make sure the targets were up and in one piece before the next volley of shots. But something felt different about this morning. Maybe it was the way the range master glanced over at her, or the way one of the SEALs nodded as she walked past him like he had noticed her, or maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another day in the background of someone else's story. She was midway through resetting the third target lane when the voice called out deep and clear, "Hey, you with the tape." She turned, thinking she had messed up, maybe crossed a line, maybe stepped too far forward into a hot zone, but the SEAL was waving her over. He held out his rifle like it was nothing, like it weighed nothing, even though she knew it did. He said, "You ever shoot one of these before?" She blinked, then looked behind her to see if someone else was there, but no, it was her. He was talking to her. She shook her head slowly, and he smiled, not in a mocking way, but like he was genuinely curious. Then he stepped aside, made space for her to stand at the line, handed her the rifle and said, "Go ahead, take the shot." She hesitated, heart thudding in her chest, hands suddenly unsure of what to do, and the range went strangely quiet, as if the others had paused to watch her. She raised the rifle like she had seen them do 100 times, the weight real in her arms, the scope catching sunlight, the paper target downrange barely visible through the blur of nerves. But she steadied herself, breathed in like she had seen them do, and waited for that stillness between moments, and then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with a force she was not prepared for, but she held on, her feet planted firmly, her breath frozen in her chest as the sound of the shot echoed across the open field. For a moment there was nothing else, just that long rolling thunder in her ears and the weight of what she had just done settling into her bones. She lowered the rifle slowly, unsure if she had hit anything at all and too nervous to look down range. But she felt the change around her, the energy shifting, the silence thick, like everyone was waiting for something. Then the spotter near the back of the line called out the words she never expected to hear: "Target hit, clean shot, center mass." The SEAL beside her gave a quiet nod like it was no big deal, but she saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes, and behind them a row of men who had spent years learning to shoot the way some people learn to breathe were suddenly looking at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, like she was part of the world they lived in. She stepped back, her heart still racing, the rifle now heavier in her hands than before, as if it had absorbed the weight of that moment. She tried to hand it back, but the SEAL shook his head and said, "Keep holding it for a bit, feel the balance, get used to it." She did not know what to say, so she said nothing, just stood there with the weapon in her hands, the same way she used to hold her dreams when she was younger, tight and cautious and afraid they would slip away behind her. The range activity resumed like nothing had changed, but something had shifted in her and in them and in the space between them, where respect is measured not in words but in actions. The next break came 20 minutes later, and she found herself standing near the equipment shed alone again, or so she thought, until the same SEAL walked over and leaned against the wall beside her. He said, "Where did you learn to shoot?" Like that she shrugged and said, "I didn't learn, not really, I just watched and listened." He smiled and said, "Watching is half the battle, listening is the other half, the rest is just guts and instinct. You have both." She wanted to laugh, to tell him that she was just the girl who taped targets, who got up before the sun and stayed after everyone left, but instead she asked him why he let her shoot. He paused, looked out at the range for a second, then said, "Sometimes you can tell when someone is ready." Even if they do not know it yet, then he handed her a smaller rifle, one used for training, and said, "Next break we try again. This time you aim for the head," and without waiting for her answer, he walked away, leaving her alone again with the weight of possibility resting in her hand. She stood by the edge of the range, the smaller rifle held tight against her chest like it was a secret. Someone had finally trusted her with the late morning sun was rising higher now, heating the dirt beneath her boots and casting long shadows behind the target frames she had set up earlier that morning. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore this time. She was not just a background figure, she was not just the one who patched paper and picked up brass. This time eyes followed her, not in judgment, not in dismissal, but in curiosity and something close to respect. She kept glancing at the rifle, trying to understand why it felt so natural in her hands, even though she had never trained, never practiced, never been taught properly, but her body remembered the way others held it, the stance, the breath control, the quiet between the inhale and the squeeze of the trigger. She had watched long enough to know, and now it was starting to come alive in her. The SEAL returned just before the break ended, gave her a simple nod, and motioned for her to follow him to the far end of the range. This section was less crowded, more isolated and quieter, as if this next test was meant to be more personal than public. He set up a new target, this time a human silhouette with a red dot over the head zone. He pointed and said, "Same distance, new challenge, headshot." She hesitated, the pressure settling over her like a weighted vest. She looked at the target so far away, it seemed smaller than she remembered. She took her position, adjusted the rifle just like before, and waited. She could feel her pulse in her hands, her heartbeat thudding in her throat, louder than the wind, louder than her own thoughts. But she found that stillness again, that tiny pocket of silence she had discovered earlier, and she slipped into it like water. She fired. The shot cracked through the range and echoed back like a question she was afraid to answer. She looked up quickly, searching the silhouette through the lingering haze of recoil, then turned to the SEAL, waiting for him to say something, anything. He gave a slow grin and said, "Center of the dot." She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and for a moment everything in her rewired itself. She was not just someone who could shoot, she was someone who had just pulled off a perfect shot under pressure with no training and no time to prepare. The SEAL handed her the rifle again and said, "Let's go 3 for 3, and she laughed, a quiet, disbelieving laugh, because suddenly the impossible was no longer out of reach. And as the others began to take notice, whispering behind her, some nodding, some just watching, she realized that maybe she had never been invisible, maybe she had just never stepped into the light until now. By the next morning, word had spread faster than she expected, and when she walked onto the range, the rhythm of the place felt different. The silence that followed her steps was no longer the silence of being ignored, it was the silence of being seen, of being measured, of being considered. The men who used to pass her without a second glance now gave small nods, some curious, some respectful, and some unsure how to react to someone who had stepped so far out of the role she was expected to play. She felt the change in every gesture, every look, every moment of hesitation when someone debated whether to speak to her or not. But she did not come to talk, she came to shoot. The SEAL met her at the edge of the field where the dust rose in thin columns and the morning heat was already beginning to press against the skin. He handed her a new rifle, this one more advanced, with custom attachments and a scope that looked like it belonged in a war zone, not a training field. He said, "Today you fire under pressure." She raised an eyebrow, and he pointed behind her where two other SEALs stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. One held a stopwatch, the other a second rifle. "You'll have 10 seconds per target," he said. 5 targets, different distances, no time to adjust, no time to think. She wanted to ask if he was serious, but the answer was already written in his stance, in the calm certainty in his voice. So she nodded, took her place, and waited for the signal. When it came, she moved without thinking, her hands reacting before her brain could catch up. The first target dropped clean, the second higher and faster was harder, but she hit it on the second try. The third and fourth pushed her harder, but she adapted, eyes sharp, breath Steady grip firm. The fifth was almost unfair, placed far off at an angle with wind cutting across the field and her arms beginning to burn, but she centered the reticle and squeezed another hit. The stopwatch clicked and the two observing seals exchanged glances, then walked off without a word. She looked at the one who brought her here, who handed her the rifle, who believed in something she did not yet understand, and he just said, "You adapt fast, faster than most." That was all he said before walking away again, leaving her in the dust with 5 shattered targets and a strange feeling curling in her chest. For the rest of the day, the other trainees approached her one by one, asking quiet questions about how she learned to shoot, what her background was, where she came from, but she gave short answers because the truth was still unfolding even to her. All she knew was that every shot pulled her closer to something bigger than herself and further from the version of her that used to just fix targets at the edge of the field. Forgotten and unseen, now all eyes were on her, and for the first time she did not look away. Days passed, and with each sunrise she found herself drawn back to the range, no longer as the girl who patched holes, but as someone who belonged there, someone who had begun to carve out a place in a world that once seemed impossible to enter. The SEAL who had handed her the rifle became a quiet presence nearby, offering little advice, but more importantly, trust and space to grow. She kept practicing shooting for hours, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, watching in silence or offering tips. She soaked it all in like dry earth drinking rain. Her confidence grew slowly, and with it the whispers around the range grew louder. No longer was she invisible, but neither was she fully accepted. It was a delicate balance of proving herself without crossing lines she did not fully understand, of navigating a world of unspoken rules and expectations that seemed designed to test her resolve. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling training session, the SEAL approached her again, this time with a small folder in his hand. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, feeling the weight of what was coming. The folder held a formal invitation to join an advanced training program, a chance few outside the elite ranks ever received. It was an opportunity to become something more, to step fully into the role that her shots had hinted she could fill, but it was also terrifying. The program meant leaving behind what she knew, risking failure and judgment from those who might never accept her, no matter how good she became. She looked up at the man who had believed in her from the start and said, "I don't know if I'm ready." He smiled and said, "Sometimes readiness comes after you say yes, not before." That night she lay awake thinking about the shot she had made, the rifle heavy in her hands and the path stretching out before her. It was uncertain and daunting, but it was hers, and for the first time she was ready to take it. She stood early the next morning at the edge of the range, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She picked up the rifle and aimed at the distant target, knowing this time the shot was more than just a bullet. It was a promise to herself to keep going, to keep proving to the world and to herself that she belonged here. And as the rifle cracked through the silence, she felt something inside her shift, a door opening to a future she had never imagined, but was now determined to claim. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the range shelter, casting long, thin beams across the dusty floor. She stood at the firing line, rifle in hand, but this time it was different. No longer a stranger to the weight or the recoil or the pressure that came with each shot. She breathed steady, her eyes locked on the target far downrange, a symbol not just of marksmanship, but of the journey that had brought her here. Her mind drifted back to the first day when she had only been there to fix targets, a simple job unseen and unremarked upon. The days spent patching holes in paper and steel, feeling invisible and forgotten. The hand of the SEAL who had offered her his rifle had changed everything, had opened a door to a world she had only dared to watch from the sidelines. Now she was no longer watching, now she was part of the story, one told in whispers and nods, one written in bullets and broken targets, and the silent respect of those who once doubted her. The training had been brutal and unforgiving, pushing her beyond limits she had never imagined, testing her body and mind in ways that left her aching and breathless. But with every lesson learned, every shot fired, her confidence grew like a fire that could not be quenched. She remembered the nights spent alone on the range, practicing under the stars, the way the rifle felt solid and true in her hands, the focus that settled over her like A shield from the doubts that tried to creep in from the edges. Her instructors no longer saw just a girl who fixed targets, but a shooter, a warrior, someone who could hold her own in a world built on precision and power. Today was the final test. A simulated mission designed to push everything she had learned into action. Her heart raced, but her hands were steady as she moved through the course, the rifle an extension of herself, the target after target falling under her gaze and her control. When it was over, the SEAL who had believed in her from the start approached with a nod of approval in his eyes and said, "Welcome to the team." She smiled, the weight of the rifle no longer a burden, but a promise, a symbol of everything she had fought for and everything she still aimed to become. She knew this was only the beginning, and as she looked out over the range, her future stretched wide open and full of possibility. The carrier thrummed with restless energy like a beast waking from a long sleep. Every corridor pulsed with whispers and glances charged with unspoken questions and tentative alliances. Arya stood firm in the center of it, all her presence a beacon for those searching for a reason to believe that courage could still carve a path through deception and fear. She moved through the crowd, her steps steady, her eyes scanning faces, young, seasoned, hardened, all waiting for a sign, for a call to action. Raise followed silently, close enough to offer support, but far enough to let her lead. The message she broadcast had shifted the mood from tension to something sharper, more alive. It was no longer about orders, it was about conviction, about choosing what was right even if it meant breaking the rules. The ship felt transformed not by technology or weapons, but by the human will that had refused to be silenced. And the bridge captain Harrow sat alone, now his chair empty of loyal officers, his authority crumbling like ancient stone. He stared at the screens displaying the destroyers in formation, their decks alive with crews who moved with purpose and certainty. His fingers trembled as he reached for the emergency protocols, but the options had been stripped away. The command had been hijacked, and the chain of command was fractured beyond repair. While the destroyers opened their communications channels, broadcasting the evidence, the files, the hidden records that exposed a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal woven through the highest ranks of naval command. It was a revelation that stunned the fleet and rocked the carrier to its core. Sailors and officers alike absorbed the truth, struggling to reconcile their years of service with the deception that had been hidden from them. Arya addressed the entire fleet again, her voice steady, unwavering. She spoke of accountability, of justice, and the need for a new beginning, a fleet built not on blind obedience but on transparency and trust. The response was immediate, and electric conversations sparked in mess halls, on decks, and briefing rooms. Whispers turned to debates to decisions, as the crew grappled with the reality that their loyalty was no longer a given, but a choice. Her eyes took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes meeting Arya's across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that they were not just fighting for control of a ship or a fleet, but for the future of something much larger than themselves. The destroyers remained in formation, their presence a constant reminder that this was a turning point, that history was being written in real time, and that every decision carried weight beyond the horizon. In the quiet moments before the next storm, Captain Harrow made one last desperate call, reaching out to any loyalist who remained, his voice filled with pleading and fury, a demand to suppress the rebellion, to restore order. But the silence was deafening. No one answered. No orders came back, only the growing chorus of a fleet reborn, choosing truth over tradition and forging a new path through the fog of war and betrayal. Dawn light seeped through the thick reinforced windows, casting long shadows across the carrier's bridge, where silence now ruled like a heavy fog, broken only by the distant hum of the destroyer's engines waiting patiently beyond the horizon. Arya stood near the command console, her posture calm, but her mind raced with the weight of what was to come. She knew the battle ahead was not just for control of a ship, but for the soul of an entire fleet. Around her, the crew moved with purpose, no longer shackled by fear or uncertainty, but driven by a new resolve born from the truth that had been unleashed like a storm breaking chains. The corridors buzzed with hushed conversations, strategies, forming alliances, shifting loyalties as the reality of the situation settled in like cold water, awakening every sense and sharpening every instinct. Tries worked alongside the communications officers, rerouting channels, ensuring that the evidence of corruption reached not only the fleet but also the command centers. Far beyond the immediate conflict, they knew that transparency was their strongest weapon, that the truth once seen could not be undone or silenced, no matter how deep the roots of deception had ground in the destroyers. The captains held tense briefings, their faces grim but determined, each commander understanding the gravity of their actions and the risks they were taking, but also the necessity of standing up against a system that had betrayed its own ideals and people. Their ships formed an unbreakable wall, a shield of conviction surrounding the carrier and its crew. Back on the carrier, Captain Harrow retreated to his quarters, the last refuge of a man who once wielded power like a weapon, but now found himself stripped of authority and isolated by the very men and women he once commanded. He stared out at the endless sea, his reflection fractured by the rippling water, a mirror of his fractured command and fading control men, while Arya gathered the senior officers for a meeting in the war room, a place that had seen countless decisions that shaped history, now hosting a new chapter where old rules no longer applied and new alliances had to be forged. Her voice was steady as she laid out a plan, not just to survive but to reform, to rebuild a fleet where integrity was the foundation and courage the compasses. The hours passed, the tension thickened, not with fear but with anticipation. A collective breath held across the fleet, waiting for the next move. The destroyers maintained their watchful presence like guardians ready to strike or shield, depending on the choice made by those on the carrier. And within the war room a silent understanding grew that this was more than a conflict, it was a reckoning. Grise glanced at Arya, a subtle nod passed between them, a quiet promise that no matter the outcome, they had already changed the course of history, and that the sea would remember their fight long after the waves swallowed the ships and the names faded into legend. The carrier was no longer just a ship, it was a symbol, a spark igniting change. In the heart of the fleet, the sun dipped low, casting an orange glow over the restless sea as the carrier and the 6 destroyers held their silent standoff, a fragile tension hanging between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Every sailor on every deck felt it, a mixture of fear, hope, and determination mingling in the salty air as the hours stretched into what felt like eternity. Arya paced the war room, her mind racing through every possible outcome, every chance for peace or for Chow's rise. Stood nearby, watching her with quiet respect, knowing that her strength was more than physical. It was a force that rallied those around her, inspiring them to face impossible odds without flinching. The destroyers' captains held their own councils, their voices low but fierce, discussing the evidence, the betrayal, the future. They were ready to back Arya's call for reform, even if it meant standing against their former commanders, their former comrades. And the carrier, the crew had begun to choose sides, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. Conversations in mess halls and corridors shifted from whispers to declarations. Allegiance was no longer automatic, it was earned through truth, through courage, and the willingness to face consequences without turning away. The atmosphere was charged as if the ship itself breathed in the new energy, feeling the pulse of revolution under its steel ribs. Captain Harrow remained isolated, a shadow drifting through empty halls. His power eroded, his authority questioned by those who once followed. Without hesitation, he tried one last time to rally a group of loyal officers, but found their resolve broken, replaced by a dawning understanding that the fleet they knew was gone, replaced by something raw and real and terrifying in its promissory. Called a final assembly, gathering every officer, every key player in the conflict together in the main hangar, a space vast and open yet filled with the weight of history and consequence. She spoke with the clarity of a leader who had faced darkness and refused to blink away the truth. Her words carried not just command but conviction, a call to build a future on the ruins of the past. Destroyers shifted their positions, slightly closing ranks, A show of solidarity and strength, their hulls glinting in the fading light, a reminder that this was not just a standoff but a siege of ideals, a test of wills that would define the legacy of the fleet for generations to come. The tension was electric. The air thick with anticipation and the unspoken question lingering over all of them who would make the first move toward peace or war. As night fell, the carrier's lights dimmed, signaling a pause, a moment of calm before the inevitable storm. Arya stood at the railing looking out over the dark water, her thoughts racing, but her resolve firm. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The truth was no longer a secret, it was a beacon, and she would fight to make sure it stayed. That Wayrise joined her silently, offering a steady presence in the gathering darkness. Together they faced the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, it was their courage and their choices that would shape the fate of the fleet and maybe even the future of the world beyond the sea. The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as the carrier and the 6 destroyers held their final formation, a fragile piece hanging like a thread stretched tight between old loyalties and new beginnings. Arya stood at the bow, her gaze fixed on the endless sea, the weight of the night before heavy, but her spirit unbroken. She knew this moment was more than an end, it was a beginning. Grise stood beside her, silent, steady, a reminder that in the face of chaos, trust could still be forged like steel tempered by fire. The crew moved with a new purpose, their faces marked by exhaustion, but also by hope. The lines between friend and foe blurred, replaced by a shared commitment to rebuild and to honor the truth that had set them free. The ship itself seemed to breathe with them, alive with the promise of what could be. In the bridge, Captain Harrow faced the reality of defeat, his command broken, his authority diminished, but in the quiet he found a flicker of clarity, a chance to reckon with the mistakes that had brought them here and to accept that sometimes the greatest battles were not fought with weapons but with courage to admit wrong and to step aside for something better. Destroyers formed a protective ring, not as enemies but as guardians, their crews watching the carrier not with hostility but with respect, their actions a testament to the power of conviction and the strength of unity forged from truth. Arya's message had resonated beyond the ship, it had reached the hearts of those willing to listen and to change. In the war room, the senior officers gathered to draft a new charter, a blueprint for a fleet reborn, one built on transparency, accountability, and respect for every voice. The conversations were fierce but honest, no longer bound by fear or blind obedience, but driven by a shared vision for a future where loyalty was earned, not demanded, and where justice was the foundation of every command. As the sun rose higher, the fleet slowly began to move in unison, a new course plotted not by a single captain but by the collective will of those who believed in a better way. The destroyers peeled away one by one, returning to their posts, but leaving behind a legacy that would shape naval history forever, a reminder that even in the darkest moments light could break through. Arya and Reyes watched the ships disappear into the horizon, their hearts heavy with the cost but light with the hope that had taken root. Their journey was far from over, but the hardest part had been done. The truth was out, the chains broken, and a new dawn rising over the sea. The carrier sailed forward, no longer just a vessel of war, but a symbol of change, a beacon for those who believed that courage and truth could transform even the most rigid systems. And as the waves lapped against the hull, the fleet carried with it a promise that the fight for justice would never end, because some stories were meant to inspire others to stand up and to break free.